The document was 17 pages long, and Counselor Vethsaron had read it 4 times before she understood what made her antennae curl. It wasn't the content. It was the signature at the bottom, a single human thumbprint pressed in black ink next to a handwritten line that read, "We accept your terms, all of them." Nobody accepted all of the Conclave's terms, not the Doraki, who had 3 homeworlds and a fleet that could eclipse a sun, not the Marathi, who had been spacefaring for 6,000 years before humans discovered fire. The Conclave's opening terms were designed to be rejected. That was the architecture of the process. You rejected the opening terms, they rejected yours, and eventually, somewhere in the middle, a civilization found its place in the hierarchy. Humanity had accepted everything, immediately, without a single counteroffer. Vethsaron set the document down on her desk and stared at the thumbprint. Why? She didn't have an answer. What she had instead was a feeling she had learned over 90 years of diplomatic service to never ignore, the specific, quiet discomfort of a situation that appeared simple. The Conclave's ultimatum had been delivered to Earth's orbital station 41 days earlier, transmitted on the standard diplomatic frequency, received by a human communications officer named Lieutenant Dara Akafer, who had been eating something called a breakfast sandwich when the message arrived. She didn't finish it. She read the transmission header, set the sandwich on her console, and opened a channel to her commanding officer. Her voice, according to the recording that would later be analyzed 1,200 times by Conclave intelligence, was completely steady. "Admiral Chen, you need to see this." The ultimatum itself was not subtle. The conclave of 7 voices, the governing body of 31 sentient species spanning 4 galactic arms, had determined that humanity's rate of expansion represented a Category 3 territorial infringement. The terms were standard for such an infringement, calibrated to a civilization at humanity's developmental stage. A 70% reduction in active colony ships, mandatory submission of all military vessel specifications, a 100-year expansion moratorium, and quarterly inspection rights over any human facility within 12 light-years of established conclave space. Civilizations that refused Category 3 terms received Category 4 escalation. No civilization had ever received Category 5. The conclave liked to point that out. Admiral Mei Chen had read the ultimatum in 4 minutes and 20 seconds, another detail that would be analyzed later, because the average response time for receiving heads of state was between 6 and 20 hours. She'd read it in 4 minutes and 20 seconds, called her senior staff, and said 7 words that Lieutenant Akafer would remember for the rest of her life. "Get me everything we have on them." That was the first mystery the Conclave's analysts couldn't solve, what exactly the humans were looking for. The second mystery arrived 3 weeks later, when the Conclave's surveillance network picked up anomalous energy signatures from 47 different human facilities simultaneously. Not weapons charging, not shield activations. The signatures matched nothing in the Conclave's database, and the Conclave's database contained the energy profiles of over 2,000 distinct technologies across 31 species. The analysts flagged it. A preliminary report was filed. Counselor Vethsaron added it to the growing pile of things about humanity that didn't slot cleanly into existing categories. The third mystery was the one that kept her awake. It was a pattern in the human communications traffic. Not the content. The conclave couldn't decrypt the content, which was itself mildly unusual, but the volume asterisk. In the 41 days between receiving the ultimatum and returning the signed acceptance, human diplomatic, military, and civilian communication traffic had increased by 900%. Not military traffic, not government traffic, all asterisk traffic. Civilian networks lighting up across every colony, every station, every ship. Whatever the humans were doing, they had told everyone. The formal acceptance arrived by courier drone, a human choice, when a standard transmission would have taken a fraction of the time. Veth Saron had noted that too. They'd sent a physical document, a physical thumbprint, like they wanted her to hold it. She was still holding it, metaphorically, 6 weeks later, when the first conclave inspection team arrived at the human colony of Satara Station. The team was led by Inspector Prime Gorentel, a Doraki male of considerable institutional experience, who had conducted 47 previous inspections across 11 species, and who had, by his own account, never encountered a situation he couldn't categorize within the first hour. He sent his preliminary report 12 hours after arrival. It contained one line: "Something is wrong here, but I cannot yet determine what." Gorentel was a careful observer. He'd built his career on careful observation, on the precise and methodical accumulation of detail that eventually resolved into understanding. He approached Satara Station the way he approached every inspection, with the assumption that what he would find was predictable, because civilizations at humanity's developmental stage were predictable asterisk. They were anxious, deferential. They moved their most sensitive operations before inspectors arrived, tried to look smaller than they were, offered hospitality that was slightly too enthusiastic. Satara Station was none of those things. It was busy, not the performed busyness of a facility trying to look productive, genuinely, chaotically, exhaustingly busy. Workers in corridors carrying components he didn't recognize. Interfaces lit with scrolling data in 3 different human languages simultaneously. And the humans themselves, they looked at his inspection team with an expression he had seen before but had never expected here. He'd seen it on Doraki faces during crisis operations, on Marathi commanders during fleet engagements. It was focus. "Excuse me," he'd said to a passing technician, a young human female with close-cropped hair and a burned scar along her left forearm. "Can you tell me what this section of the station is currently processing?" She'd looked at him the way he would later realize you look at someone who has just asked a mildly irrelevant question during a complicated procedure. "Coordination," she said and kept walking. "Coordination of what?" he called after her. She didn't answer. Not from rudeness, she was already talking into a communications piece in her ear, her attention completely elsewhere. He wrote asterisk coordination in his report and stared at it. "They accepted our terms," said his assistant, Veloron, standing beside him in the corridor. "Completely. So why do they look like they're preparing for something?" Gorentel had no answer. He filed the preliminary report. He continued the inspection. He didn't sleep well that night. In the quarters the station had provided, comfortable quarters, he noted, better than standard. The humans had given them good rooms. They'd also given them unrestricted access to everything they'd asked to see. Everything they'd asked to see, exactly, nothing more. He realized, at approximately 300 station time, staring at the ceiling, that he didn't know what he hadn't thought to ask for. Back in conclave chambers, Veth Saron was reading Gorentel's follow-up reports when her senior analyst, a young Marathi named Sulven, set a secondary file in front of her without speaking. She looked up. "Cross-reference," Sulven said, "between the unknown energy signatures and a human public record, their civilian archive, unrestricted, anyone could access it." She looked at the file. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading, because the human archive wasn't organized the way conclave databases were. It wasn't organized at all in the conventional sense. It was accumulated, layered, cross-linked in ways that assumed familiarity. But the specific record Sulven had flagged was clear enough. It was a historical account, an old one by human standards, approximately 500 years old, give or take, describing an event from an earlier period of human history. It described a pattern of behavior a human civilization had once employed, against a significantly more powerful adversary. Not a military pattern. Something else. Vethsaron read it twice. Then she read the part about the energy signatures again. Sulven, she said carefully, how long have we had these cross-referenced? I finished the analysis 40 minutes ago. And who else has seen this? Sulven paused, which was significant for a Marathi who didn't pause. No one yet. I came to you first. Vethsaron set the file down very deliberately. Get me a closed channel to Gorentel, now, and Sulven, she waited until he turned. Don't file this report through standard channels. You think it changes things? I think, she said quietly, that if I'm reading this correctly, the humans didn't accept our ultimatum. He waited. I think they countered it, and we didn't notice. Gorentel received her call at 3:40 and spent the next 4 hours not sleeping in a different way. Not the vague unease of before, but the specific, cold alertness of someone who has suddenly understood that the building they're standing in has a different floor plan than the one they were given. He went back through his inspection notes systematically. The coordination the technician had mentioned, the unknown energy signatures, the 90% increase in civilian communications traffic, the fact that humans had sent a asterisk physical document when a transmission would have sufficed. He pulled up the historical record Vethsaron had sent him. Read it again. Then he walked back out into Satara Station's main corridor at 400, and he stood there watching the humans move, and he understood not completely, not yet, but enough, that the busyness he was watching wasn't preparation. It was already in progress. Whatever the humans were doing, they had started doing it 41 days ago, the moment they received the ultimatum. Not after deliberation, not after consulting allies or buying time or filing protests with secondary bodies. The moment they got the terms, they began. He found himself at a station observation deck, watching a human cargo transport undock from the far end of the station. It was heading toward the outer markers. Routine designation on the manifest. Materials transfer, Colony 7. He looked at the manifest entry for 30 seconds. Then he contacted his technical analyst aboard the Conclave ship. The cargo transport that just left Satara. Cross-reference its declared cargo weight against the departure mass sensor. A pause. Inspector Prime, there's a discrepancy. How large? The transport is carrying approximately 12,000 metric tons, more than declared. Gorentel watched the transport until it slipped out of visual range, into the dark. File nothing, he said. I need to make another call. Vethsaron had been a diplomat for 90 years. She had watched civilizations make mistakes at every stage of development. The most common mistake, the one she had seen destroy negotiating positions and destabilize alliances across 4 decades of conclave politics, was not aggression. It wasn't arrogance. It was a simpler failure. Assuming that the other party was playing the same game. She was in the middle of reconstructing the sequence of events, really reconstructing it, working backwards from the signed acceptance with everything she now suspected. When Sulven returned with a secondary analysis she hadn't asked for. I pulled human historical communication records, he said, setting the file in front of her. Not the diplomatic traffic, civilian archives, public record. She looked up. There's a term they use, he said, historically, for a specific kind of response to an adversary with greater immediate power. He pointed to a section of the archive. The translation algorithm flagged it as approximately meaning to comply on the surface while preparing underneath, but that's not the literal translation. Vethsaron looked at the term. Her translator rendered it stone water. Stone water. In their historical context, stone that has water moving through it appears solid. Water is already inside. She stared at the phrase for a long time. The acceptance, she said finally. The thumbprint, the physical document, they sent us a asterisk message asterisk. I believe so. They were telling us they accepted the cage. She pressed both hands flat on the desk, and the document itself was telling us the cage was already stone water. I don't think they expected us to read it that way in time, Sulven said. They didn't need us to, she stood. It wasn't a message for us. It was a message for their own people, delivered in a way we could witness. She moved toward the door. Get me the full conclave council, emergency session, all 7 voices, and pull every piece of surveillance data we have on human territory going back 41 days. Every cargo manifest, every energy signature, every civilian communication we can access. What are we looking for? She paused at the doorway, evidence of what they've already finished. The emergency session of the conclave of 7 voices convened 14 hours later, and the presentation that Vethsaron delivered lasted 3 hours. She began with the energy signatures. 47 human facilities had activated simultaneously. The signatures had no match in the conclave database, but when Sulven's analysis team ran the composite pattern through a theoretical framework, not a technology framework, a asterisk logistics asterisk framework, the picture that emerged was not of a weapon, not of a shield, not of anything the conclave had a word for. It was the picture of a network. A new network, assembled in the 41 days between receiving the ultimatum and returning the signed acceptance, using existing infrastructure, cargo routes, communication relays, civilian manufacturing chains, in ways those systems had never been used, like water finding channels in stone that hadn't been channels before. The cargo discrepancy at Satara station wasn't isolated. Sulven's team had found 47 similar discrepancies, not in military transports, in civilian ones, agricultural ships, educational supply vessels, medical transports, thousands of small shipments moving in patterns that looked individually like routine civilian logistics. Looked collectively like a deliberate and coordinated redistribution of something across every human colony within 12 light-years of conclave space. What are they redistributing? Asked Counselor Priem of the Doraki, whose voice carried the particular flatness of someone asking a question they suspect will unsettle them. Vethsaron had prepared for this question. We don't fully know, she said, but based on the mass signatures and known human manufacturing profiles, our best current analysis indicates components, parts, modular components for, she paused, for facilities that do not yet exist. The chamber was quiet. They're building something, Priem said. They built something, Vethsaron corrected, past tense. The network activation was 41 days ago. Whatever the components were for, they've been arriving at their destinations for over a month. They aren't building. They've already built. We've had inspection teams in human territory this entire time. Yes, and the teams found exactly what they asked to find. She let that settle. Our inspection protocols were designed for civilizations that hide their capabilities. They weren't designed for a civilization that moved its capabilities while we were designing the inspection protocols. In the same 41 days, they used our own ultimatum timeline as cover, said the Marathi counselor. As a clock, Vethsaron said, they knew exactly how long they had before the first inspection teams arrived. They used every day of it. The question of what the humans had built remained, for the next 6 days, the central obsession of conclave intelligence. Gorentel's team worked backward from Satara Station's data. Sulven's analysts cross-referenced the civilian archives with every scrap of human engineering literature they could access. 3 separate linguistic teams attempted to decrypt the human internal communications and failed. It was Gorentel on the 5th day who found the piece that mattered. He'd been reviewing inspection footage from a human facility on the edge of their declared territory. A small installation, agricultural designation, barely worth noting. But in the background of a routine walkthrough, barely visible, was a piece of equipment that didn't match the facility's stated purpose. He ran it through every database. Nothing matched. Then he asked a different question. Not what is this? He asked asterisk what would you need this for if you were a human engineer, given the constraints the Conclave had just imposed. The analyst who answered him was a young Doraki named Vel, who had specialized in human engineering literature specifically because it was, as he put it, structurally unlike anything else in the database. They solve problems sideways. Vel looked at the equipment image for 11 minutes. Then he said very quietly, "That's a relay." "For what system?" "Not for any system I recognize." He pulled up a theoretical schematic. "But if you were trying to build an autonomous manufacturing network, one that could operate independently of any central hub, this is the kind of component you'd need at each node to maintain synchronization without a command structure." Gorentel stared at the schematic. Without a command structure. Distributed, self-sustaining. No single point that can be shut down because there's no single point. Vel looked up. "Inspector Prime, if the humans have built a network like this across their territory, and if it's been running for over a month, it doesn't matter what we inspect, because none of it runs from a center we can find." Gorentel sat down, slowly. "They didn't just comply with the inspection terms," he said. "They made the inspections irrelevant," Vel said. "Sir, whatever they're producing, whether it's ships or components or something we don't have a category for yet, they're producing it in a way that's already outside the parameters of our agreement, because our agreement assumed a centralized infrastructure. And they don't have one anymore." "They didn't build a new system," Vel said. He hesitated because Doraki analysts were trained not to express uncertainty, but he expressed it anyway. "I think they became a new system. During the 41 days, all that civilian communication traffic." He pulled up the volume graph. "They weren't hiding, they were coordinating. Every colony, every station, every civilian network all at once." Gorentel looked at the graph for a long time. "Get me Counselor Vethsaron." In the conclave chambers, the second presentation was shorter than the first. Vethsaron delivered 3 images and a single conclusion. The images were the relay component from the agricultural station, the cargo mass discrepancy map, and the civilian communication volume graph. The conclusion: the conclave's ultimatum had, structurally speaking, succeeded. Humanity had reduced its colony ship fleet by the required 70%, had submitted military vessel specifications, had agreed to the expansion moratorium, had accepted inspection rights. All of it true, all of it verifiable. None of it the point. "They gave us the cage," Vethsaron said, "because they were already living outside it. By the time our inspectors arrived, the infrastructure we were attempting to inspect had been superseded by one our frameworks weren't designed to see." "Then we escalate," Counselor Priem said. "Category 4 terms, mandatory." "Mandatory what?" Vethsaron asked. Priem paused. "Our Category 4 terms assume a target with a centralized government that can be pressured, centralized infrastructure that can be monitored, and centralized resources that can be restricted." She set her hands on the table. "We issued those terms to a species that, in 41 days, responded by decentralizing, voluntarily, comprehensively, at civilian scale." She let that land. "If we issue Category 4 terms, they will accept those too, immediately. And while we're reviewing their compliance, they will do something else we have not anticipated." The chamber was very quiet. "We don't know," said the Marathi counselor slowly, "what they're actually making." "No. And we don't know," said another counselor, "why they're willing to comply with restrictions that disadvantage them, in exchange for the time to do something we can't see." "No." Vethsaron looked around the chamber. "What we know is that they looked at our ultimatum terms designed by the most experienced diplomatic body in 4 galactic arms, terms that have shaped the development of 31 civilizations, and their first response, within minutes, was to ask what those terms didn't cover. Lieutenant Dara Akafer had not eaten the rest of her breakfast sandwich on the morning she received the ultimatum. She had, however, eaten it 41 days later, reheated, when the acceptance was confirmed transmitted, and the first phase of what the internal human planning documents called Operation Stone Water was confirmed complete. It had not, she reflected, been a good sandwich. It was better the second time. She was in the middle of that reheated sandwich when Admiral Chen appeared in the doorway of the communications bay. Kefer. Sir. How are our nodes? She checked the board. All 47 operational, synchronization holding at 94% efficiency. Medical supply network went live at 600, agricultural processing at 900. She paused. The civilian manufacturing chains have come online faster than projected. Ambassador Reyes' team says the outer colonies are running ahead of schedule by about 2 weeks. Admiral Chen nodded, looked at the board for a moment, then looked at Akafer. The Conclave's inspection teams requested access to processing Block 7. We gave it to them. I know, a brief pause, and Block 9. They didn't ask. Chen made a small sound that wasn't quite a smile. No, they didn't. She turned to leave, then stopped. The counselor, Veth Saron, her communication traffic to the chamber has tripled in the last 24 hours. Akafer considered this. She figured it out. Some of it. Does it matter? Admiral Chen thought for a moment. It was a genuine pause, the kind that meant the question was being taken seriously rather than deflected. It matters, she said finally, because it means we have maybe 72 hours before they make a decision about escalation, and we need them to make that decision on our terms. Which are? The same ones they gave us. Chen's voice was entirely level, all of them. Akafer stared after her for a long moment after she left. Then she looked at Processing Block 9's status indicator, which showed green and had been showing green for 3 weeks, and which no Conclave inspector had requested access to. She finished her sandwich. The Conclave's emergency session on day 49 produced 3 proposed responses, and a 4th option that had never been formally proposed before in the body's 1100-year history. The first 3 proposals were standard escalation frameworks, each one larger, each one more coercive, each one premised on the assumption that humanity would at some point resist compliance, and that resistance would give the Conclave a justification to act. Vethsaron proposed the 4th option. We asked them, she said. The chamber made a sound that, across 6 different species nonverbal communication registers, uniformly expressed the same thing, disbelief. We asked them, she repeated, directly, what they're building, why they complied, what they want. She looked at each face in the chamber in turn. Because right now we are operating on a strategic model in which humanity is a subordinate civilization being managed, and every piece of evidence we have gathered in the last 49 days suggests that is not the situation we are in. You're proposing we negotiate, Priem said. I'm proposing we acknowledge that we're already in a negotiation we simply weren't informed of when it started. And if they refuse to tell us what they're building, then we will have learned something important about what they want. She set both hands flat on the table, a gesture she'd used once before in this chamber, and she saw Sulven notice. I have been in diplomatic service for 90 years. I have watched civilizations make one mistake above all others, and it is this. They assume the species across the table is afraid of the same things they are. She paused. Humanity received an ultimatum from the most powerful governing body in 4 galactic arms. They had 41 days to respond, and what they were afraid of, what they spent every one of those 41 days protecting, was not their fleet, not their government, not their territory. She slid a document to the center of the table. Sulven's final analysis, 3 pages, dense with data that resolved at the end of the third page into a single finding. The distributed network the humans had built, the relay nodes, the synchronized civilian manufacturing chains, the decentralized production infrastructure, was not primarily military. It was medical, agricultural, educational, communication infrastructure, energy distribution. The components flowing to every colony, every station, every human installation within 12 light-years were not weapons components. They were the infrastructure of basic survival and continuity, rooted in a way that required no central authority to maintain. They spent 41 days, Vethsaron said quietly, making sure that if we destroyed their government, their fleet, their stations, their central infrastructure, their people would survive, independently, indefinitely, without a chain of command to cut. The chamber was entirely still. "They didn't build a weapon," said the Marathi counselor. "No. They built a civilization that can't be held hostage," Priam said. His voice had changed. "Because there's no center to hold." "They looked at our ultimatum," Vethsaron said, "and the thing they were afraid of losing was not power, it was people. And then they spent 41 days making those people impossible to threaten." She picked up the document. "I want to know what's in processing block 9. Not because I think it's a weapon, because I think it's the last piece of this, and I want to understand the whole architecture before I sit across a table from Admiral Mei Chen and attempt to have a conversation with someone who spent 41 days thinking further ahead than I did." Processing block 9 was not difficult to request access to, it turned out. Gorentel sent the formal request through standard channels at 700 on day 50. The approval came back in 4 minutes. The same 4 minutes, he realized, that Admiral Chen had spent reading the original ultimatum. The escort who met him at the block's entrance was Lieutenant Dara Akafer, who had a communications piece in her ear and a tablet under one arm, and who did not look like someone who was worried about what he was about to see. "Lieutenant," he said, "what is this facility?" She held the door for him. "This is where we process the applications." He stepped inside. The room was large and it was full of people, and every one of them was working with the focused, quiet intensity he'd seen everywhere on Satara station. But the work here was different. No components, no engineering schematics. The screens he could see showed documents, records, profiles. "Applications for what?" he asked. Akafer looked at him directly. She had, he noted, the same expression as the Burns card technician from his first day, the look of someone answering a question that is slightly beside the point, but answering it honestly anyway. "For residency," she said, "in human territory." He looked at the room again, at the profiles on the screens, at the language headers on the documents which were not, he now realized, in human languages. They were in Doraki, in Marathi, in the trade scripts of 6 species he recognized and 4 he didn't. "Who is applying?" he asked, though part of him already knew because he'd spent 50 days learning to think sideways. "Citizens of Conclave member species," Akafer said. "Approximately 90,000 applications in the first 3 weeks, over 300,000 now. Scientists, engineers, agricultural specialists, teachers, people who watch the conclave issue us an ultimatum and would like to be somewhere else when the next one gets issued." She adjusted the tablet under her arm. "The distributed network is partly infrastructure. Partly it's so we can actually support that many new residents without overburdening any single colony." Gorentel stood in the middle of processing block 9 and looked at the screens and understood, with the specific, cold clarity of a careful observer who has finally accumulated enough detail, the full architecture of what humanity had done. They hadn't built a weapon, they hadn't built a shield, they had built an offer. An open one, broadcast on civilian networks to every species in conclave space during 41 days of elevated communication traffic, disguised as internal coordination because it was internal coordination and also, simultaneously, an advertisement. Come here. We're building something different. We'll be fine even if the conclave tries to stop us. Come here while there's still room. The compliance with the ultimatum had been genuine. The terms were acceptable because the terms addressed a version of humanity that was already changing shape underneath them. The thumbprint, the physical document, not defiance, not submission, a record, a date stamp, proof for anyone reading it afterward that on this day, humanity had looked at a cage and responded by making the cage describe something that no longer existed. Lieutenant HFY, Gorentel said. Yes. When Admiral Chen read the ultimatum, those first 4 minutes, he looked at her. What was she doing? HFY was quiet for a moment. He had the impression she was deciding how honest to be, and then deciding that honesty was, at this point, the only thing with any remaining tactical value. She was counting, HFY said. Member species in the conclave, population figures, dissatisfaction indices from the last 3 conclave policy cycles. How many people in your space might want something you weren't offering? He nodded slowly. The ultimatum gave us the deadline, HFY said. Admiral Chen just decided to use it. Vethsaron received Gorentel's report at 1400 on day 50, read it once, and sat with it for a long time before she said anything to Sul Ven. What she finally said was, "They're going to win." Sul Ven didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. Win what? That's the question, isn't it? She set the report down. They're not trying to defeat us. They're not trying to replace us. They're building something that makes the question of defeating or replacing irrelevant. She looked at the window, at the stars visible beyond it. In 50 days, they have received an ultimatum, complied with it completely, built a civilization-scale distributed infrastructure, absorbed a public health and agricultural improvement network for their outer colonies, opened residency to 300,000 dissatisfied citizens of our member species, and filed an objection to exactly nothing. What do you want to do? She was quiet for a long time. I want to call Admiral Chen, she said. Not through a diplomatic channel, not a formal negotiation. I want to call her the way you call someone who has just shown you something you didn't know was possible and ask how they thought of it. And what do you think she'll say? Vethsaron picked up the signed acceptance document, the thumbprint, the handwritten line. We accept your terms, all of them. I think, she said, she'll say they were afraid, and I think she'll mean it because they were. She set the document down carefully. They were afraid of exactly what the ultimatum threatened, and that fear didn't make them compliant. It made them impossible to threaten the same way twice. She stood. Get me the channel. The call lasted 47 minutes. Vethsaron would later describe it in private as the most clarifying conversation of her diplomatic career. She would not describe its contents to the full council for another 3 weeks, and when she did, she left out the moment, 11 minutes in, when she had asked Admiral Chen directly whether humanity had been afraid. Chen had looked at her through the screen for a long moment. Then she'd said, "Every day of it." And that didn't stop you. No, a pause. Counselor, has fear ever stopped a human from protecting their family? Vethsaron had not had an immediate answer. She was still thinking about the question 3 weeks later, sitting in the conclave chamber, watching the vote on the new framework agreement. Not an ultimatum, not a term submission. A framework, a word that implied 2 parties, neither subordinate, reach its final count. 6 votes in favor, 1 abstention. The abstention was Priem. She understood why. The Doraki had been at the top of the conclave hierarchy for 300 years, and the new framework implied a structure in which that position was no longer guaranteed. She didn't blame him. She'd spent a long time in the last 3 weeks thinking about what it felt like to have the ground shift. Outside the chamber, 312,000 residency applications were being processed by humans who looked, to all observers, like people doing entirely routine administrative work. The distributed network was running at 97% efficiency. 7 human colony worlds had reported record agricultural yields as a side effect of the new infrastructure. A medical distribution network that the Conclave's own internal reports had flagged as a model for improving care in 3 of its member systems, was operating on principles apparently developed in the 41 days during which humanity was responding to an ultimatum. The framework agreement passed. Veth-Saron signed it with a standard conclave seal, efficient, digital, unremarkable. The human ambassador, a quiet man named Eli Reyes who had said almost nothing throughout the entire formal negotiation, signed it with a physical pen. She watched him press it to the page and wondered if he was leaving a thumbprint too, and whether she would understand it in time. Probably not. She was starting to think that was the point, that humanity's communication was always operating on multiple registers simultaneously, that by the time you decoded the top layer, the deeper one had already moved somewhere else. Not deception, not manipulation, something more like breathing, constant, automatic, so fundamental they probably didn't notice they were doing it. Reyes looked up from the signed document and met her eyes. "Counselor," he said, "thank you for calling." She meant to say something diplomatic, something measured, 90 years of experience in the right words at the right moment. What she said instead was, "When you received the ultimatum, all of you, every colony, every station, your communication traffic increased by 900%. All civilians, in the first 3 days. What were they saying to each other?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. He had the same quality she'd noticed in every human she'd spoken to in the last 50 days, the impression of someone who was always, underneath the conversation, thinking about something else. Not distraction, the opposite of distraction, a kind of additional depth that ran concurrent with everything visible on the surface. "They were scared," he said, "and they were asking each other what they needed. That's all. That's everything." He picked up the signed document, looked at it briefly, set it back down. "Counselor, we're not a military species. We're not a conquering species. We've spent most of our history figuring out how to not destroy each other, and we're still not very good at it." A pause, brief and genuine. "But when something threatens the people we love, we get very quiet and very focused, and we start asking what we can do that nobody's thought to do yet. And we keep asking until we find it." He left the document on the table. She held it for a long time after he left. The conclave of 7 voices had, in its 1100 years of operation, shaped the development of 31 civilizations. It had issued ultimatums, enforced frameworks, managed expansions, arbitrated conflicts. It had seen species go from pre-spaceflight to galactic membership. It had seen civilizations with larger fleets, older histories, more ancient technologies. It had never, in 1100 years, issued an ultimatum and received a response that made the ultimatum a gift. 50 days, a thumbprint on paper, a network that couldn't be held hostage, 300,000 people choosing a different future, a distributed system built from civilian infrastructure, agricultural routes, and the question, "What do you need?" asked across 900% more communication channels than anyone thought to monitor. Not stronger, not older, not more powerful. Just unwilling, constitutionally, fundamentally, at the cellular level of how they organize themselves, to stay within the shape of someone else's threat. The galaxy had spent 50 days trying to understand what humanity had built. Veth-Saron sat alone in the chamber and realized, finally, that the building had never stopped. The framework agreement was not an ending. It was a timestamp, evidence for anyone reading it later that on this day, the conclave had looked at humanity and made the only move still available. It had asked to be part of whatever came next. And humanity, in the way of stone that water has been moving through for a very long time, had said yes. Whether that was generosity or patience, whether there was a difference, with humans, she suspected she would spend the rest of her career finding out. Outside the chamber windows, the stars held their positions, unchanged, indifferent, ancient beyond all political calculation. Somewhere in the space between them, 47 relay nodes were humming in perfect synchronization, connected by no command, answering to no center, sustaining themselves on the same logic that had sustained the species that built them. That the only threat with no counter is the one that cannot find a single point to threaten. Vethsaron turned off the chamber lights and left the signed document on the table. In the morning, the conclave would begin the process of learning how to govern in a galaxy where humanity had already quietly changed the rules. They would be afraid. She knew her colleagues, their anxieties, their pride. She found, to her own surprise, that she was not afraid. She was, more than anything, curious. That, she thought, was probably the most dangerous thing they'd done to her.